One topic that I felt that there was a lot of interest in would be podcasting in the classroom. Podcasting can be something that is relatively easy, quick to set up, and it does have a lot of rewards for having your students participate in podcasting. Just a couple things to go over. Listening to podcasts. Why would we want to have our students listen to podcasts? Listening to stories helps us become better learners. Vocabulary that we would not normally be able to read, we can listen to, and we're familiar with that vocabulary that we wouldn't normally be. It also, if you listen to a podcast and you read at the same time, it also helps with your reading fluency, reading rates. So there's a lot of different reasons why we should be reading or listening to podcasts in our classroom. On the other hand, we can create podcasts. There's lots of different reasons why you might want to create podcasts in your classroom. Understanding the content, your podcast, whether it be something subject-based or just working together, having better relationships with students, the students they'll understand the content and they'll retain the content better. They'll also have motivation for expressing themselves, expressing what they have learned. They'll have a stronger sense of community because this is not something that they do on their own. You're going to work on this as a class or in groups, and they need to be able to work with those people in their group, in their class, to be successful in a podcast. And it's something that's very popular nowadays and that is not probably going to go anywhere anytime soon. And it's getting them ready for those skills that they're probably going to need in the future. So when we talk about podcasting, there is a term that I learned about, which is micro podcasting. Micro podcasting pretty much is taking podcasting and doing it so that you don't have a lot of the need for different devices, the fancy podcasting devices. You don't need the editing tools. You don't need the skill to edit all of the recordings. It's just putting podcasting into small little bits that you can share with your audience. Like I said, no editing, no special devices. You can do it straight from your laptop, your Chromebook. You can do it from an iPad, from a cell phone. And as long as you have somewhere to keep those recordings, you could record on anything. And all students and staff do have something to keep those recordings. They can put it right there on their Google Drive. You can share straight from your Google Drive. If you would prefer to upload to YouTube, the teachers would have to upload to YouTube. Students do not have that ability anymore. But sharing from Google works just the same. You would just share those recordings as a link, or you could use one of these programs that I'm going to go over. There's three main programs that you could use for podcasting. You might be familiar with them: Mote, which is a Google product, Flipgrid, and Padlet. And then also Seesaw, you could use that as a micro podcast, or there's also an app called Book Creator. So I wanted to go through the three types of programs that you could use a podcast. The first one is Mote. Mote you're going to use in conjunction with Google Slides. And pretty much you create a Google slide that the students are going to insert their audio clips to. And you could have one slideshow for the whole year, and each slide is one episode of your podcast. The students, again, they'll use their Chromebook, their laptop to record, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. The students can do this anonymously, or they can add a picture to their audio. They can add like an emoji, a Bitmoji, or they can just put their name. There's a couple templates that I have shared in the the presentation that you can look at, but I just wanted to show you what one of these would look like. So this is my podcast slideshow, and I would give it a title page. And then this is episode 1. So like I said, you can add their name. This is just the text box that I added under it, but you also could add an image, a Bitmoji, or you can just keep them anonymous. So if I just take off my text box right here, then this is anonymous and no one will ever know what student that is. And all the student is going to do, they need to make sure that they have the Chrome extension Mote, which is easy to do. The student is just going to click Mote. They'll click Start. And now you can tell it's counting down. So I'm recording. So this is where the student would put their portion of the podcast. You notice it's only 25 seconds. But they could do multiple if you wanted them to do that. But for a micro podcast, you don't want this to be too long. So 25 seconds, as long as your students know what they're saying and they have it prepared, I think that probably would be enough time for this. And then it just saves it to your document. So here is my icon for my audio note. I can make this bigger. I can move it over here. Oops. And then there's a couple things that you can do to a couple settings over here. But you also can add a text box under it. You can add a picture. And this is your first episode of your podcast. So if you had a certain topic for this episode, you would just put that right here. And then your listener would be able to listen to all of the different students' audio notes as their contribution to the podcast. And then when you're ready to share out, you would just share it. And if you wanted it open to anyone in the school, you would just copy the link. But if you wanted it open to anyone online, you could just do open with the link. Anyone online with the link is a viewer, and just copy. And this is the link that you will share. You could do a QR code if you wanted to. So if you wanted to maybe post it out in the hallway for students and staff to easily get to it, you can do that too. And you can post it on your website. If you have a class social media page, that's where you would post that. I just wanted to show you this template that I found. And it has all kinds of templates for podcasts. So if you wanted to break it down a little bit more, have more organization. So these are my episodes, the description, what are some show notes, and then you can fill in how you want your podcast to be, to flow. And you could give each student or each group of students a different part of the podcast, or you can just have it open-ended. Here's our question or our topic that we're discussing. Everyone insert your audio note based on that topic. You can also use templates like fact and opinion, Venn diagram, debates. You would just add that as a picture or as the background on your slide. And then the students can put their audio notes in certain areas, depending, let's say if it's a debate for or against, the students that are for could put it under for, students that are against can put it under against, and kind of a debate podcast. I did put a link to Mote right here. So if you weren't familiar with Mote, and then I have these 2 links for you. So now to Flipgrid. A lot of you are familiar with Flipgrid. You've used it in your classroom. There's lots of many different reasons why you might want to use Flipgrid for different things, but you can use it for micro podcasting. Pretty much you just need an area for your students to place their audio recordings, and that's pretty much what Flipgrid is. So the teacher would create a Flipgrid. Each Flipgrid could be an episode of your podcast, and you would just share that Flipgrid to your audience. The students add their responses. You can add video or you can keep it just audio, either way. Students can leave their audio note as anonymous, or they can add a picture, just like using Mote. A couple other uses you could use for Flipgrid: creating book trailers. You could have one episode of your podcast book trailers for different books the students have read. If you did a science experiment, you could do before, during, and after a science experiment and sharing what they learned, what they didn't know before that experiment. Current events. You could pick a current event every week and have your students discuss what they've discussed in class, or how they feel about a current event, or just what's happening in class. You could do a podcast for every week. On Friday, you have a discussion of an overview of what you've done in class this week, and then the students, maybe as an exit ticket, they can record an audio note for the podcast. And then you would just share the link to your Flipgrid. So here's an example of a Flipgrid podcast. And so this is my one Flipgrid that I created. I just created a Flipgrid and I just named it Podcast Week 1. And then ours is for what's happening in class. And then this is what it looks like to have your students add their audio notes. So then the listeners, they would just click on each of the audio notes and go through your Flipgrid. And then in order to share this on the teacher side of Flipgrid, you would just get the link and share it out. You can post it, and then your audience will be able to participate. Padlet. Padlet is another website. It is not free past 3 Padlets. So there would be a fee if you wanted to use this over time. But pretty much it works the same way. You create a Padlet, your students add their audio notes. But Padlet, you can add up to a 15-minute audio note. Again, students can add a picture to the recording, or they can keep it anonymous. You could use Padlet to create short recordings as a review guide. So as the year goes on, you can create Padlets to review for the end of the year for, let's say, an end of the year test. Or if you wanted to create it to help future classes, you pretty much, by doing your podcast, you're creating a guide for those students for next year. They can also describe, I thought this was a really cool idea, not really a podcast, but I guess it could possibly be, but you could just do a project where each student is matched up with another student. So you could do it in a different class, different school, and they are going to describe something, whether it be creating something like with their hands, like with paper, different types of materials, or just drawing something. The person who's creating the audio note would describe step by step how to do something. And the person who listens, whoever their partner is, they would have to recreate based on that description. This is kind of like that activity that sometimes we'll do with like creating or making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You don't realize that you have to say every single step. So that's kind of a cool activity that you could do. Math procedure explanations. So the students could explain, you could have one math problem each week, and the students could explain in their own words how they solve that problem. And here's an example of a Padlet podcast. And Padlet is a little bit different. There's different ways you can organize your Padlet. The one that I chose is a stream. So the listeners would just scroll down to find the different audio notes, but you also create a new one just to show you what the different Padlets could look like. So these are your different options: a wall, a stream, a grid, a shelf, points on a map, a canvas, or a timeline. And like I said before, it is a 3 Padlet minimum. at a time. So you can only have 3 Padlets created. But if you wanted to try to get the upgraded version, you would have as many as you need. And here's the link to Padlet. So some things to consider when you are creating a podcast, whether it be a micro podcast or a full-blown podcast. And this is something that you should talk to your students about. Have an understanding of what is our purpose? Why are we doing this? What is our goal? What do we want to get across? Is it purely content driven, or is it community driven? We want to reach out to our community, our school. You need to have a common goal. Who's your audience? Is this meant for other students in the school? And even in the school, is this meant for an upper school student or a lower school student? That's going to change how you create your podcast. Is it meant for the community? Any of those different groups, you're going to have a lot of things that you need to consider before creating it. Why? Why would the listeners listen to your podcast? What's going to bring them in? What's going to bring them back to listen to your future episodes? I would possibly find other podcasts and maybe pick out things that you like about those ones that you might want to include in your podcast. Who will you be working with? Is it small groups? Is it students individually? Is it a whole class? That also changes how you would create your podcast. What format would you like to have? And I forgot to finish my sentence. Are there some that you have listened to that you like and you want to bring in some features that those podcasts have? I would have some kind of template or notes, something for the students to look at when they are recording. You don't want to just have them fly by the seat of their pants recording something and not really knowing what they're going to say. So all of those are different things that you should consider. Like I said, if you're micro podcasting, if you're just using Mote or Flipgrid or Padlet, something like that, you don't need any fancy tools. You don't need any podcasting gear. You can just use your device. If you want to have more of a professional podcast, there are a couple suggestions that I found are to have a decent device with decent storage that has a microphone and space for you to save the recordings. You can push the recordings over and upload to Google once you have recorded, but you have to have the space on your computer to actually do the recording. Headphones. It's not a necessity, but it is something good to have while you are recording, especially to block out noise in the room, and also for editing. One they said that is particularly good is Apple earbuds, because it pushes out or filters out the outside noise, but it only gets the person who's actually speaking. If you are not going the route of using a website or a document slideshow to share your podcast, you're going to have some type of hosting service. The ones that I found that were suggested are Soundtrap Education, Anchor, and Libsyn are popular hosting services. So you would have to look into that. And also editing tools. If you are going to do any editing, adding, maybe you want to add like a theme song at the beginning or something like that, you would need some type of editing tool. Audacity does have a free online version. There's also GarageBand and Soundtrap. Those are also programs that you could use to edit. And then just a couple of podcasting tips that I found, and it sounds a little strange, but smile while you speak. Your voice does change when you are smiling and you're excited about what you're talking about. You can tell that you're passionate. Also, have tissues nearby. Microphones pick up things that you might not realize they would pick up. I'm just going to leave it right there. Do vocal stretches before recording. I I don't think you need to do any like crazy singing or anything, but just maybe practice, go through a couple times what you're going to say just to warm up your voice. And one thing they did suggest is if you are taking notes while you are podcasting, make sure you're doing that on paper with pencil instead of typing, because you will hear the sound of the keyboard. And then I linked a couple podcasting resources that have a lot of resources on them. I really like this one, the New York Times, over 1,000 writing prompts for students. You could totally use those for podcast topics. And then just a podcast guide for students. So any of these would be helpful to get started, but really the first thing you need to do is you need to consider these questions right here. Why are you doing it? Who are you doing this for? Why would someone want to listen to your podcast? You need to think of these things. I would love to help anyone if they want to try podcasting or micro podcasting in their class. Just reach out and I would love to help you. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.